I've been thinking a lot about art, this obsession to make art and what an artist is as being something of a neurosis, of a mental disorder. And mind you, I'm not subscribed to this. It's just a thought that I was kind of toying with, and it's come up a few times in conversation with different artists and different people. Really it was born from a lot of observations that I had made working with different artists and seeing the patterns that in the lifestyle of different artists. And I mean, when I say artist, again, I'm using it as a umbrella term, meaning anyone who creates, basically a comedian, a painter, a sculptor, an actor, a musician, a writer, and so on. I can spot an artist in a crowd. I really can. It's sort of like spotting someone from your home planet of, Neptune, and you just know another Neptunian when you see one. And I started looking at artists as as a study of people. Like if you were a scientist who went to Africa and were studying some indigenous tribe, you watch their behaviors and their routines and their beliefs and patterns and rituals and all these things. If you were looking at artists the same way and sort of jotting down all these themes and common interests and beliefs and everything, it's just whatever goes into being an artist, and ask yourself, is there something to this? Is there a collectiveness here? I would say there is, and I think there is. Even when I meet an artist she could be an 80-year-old woman who paints flowers, and there's this certain set, usually a set of qualities that are just totally universal, the same type of things that you might observe in a much younger comedian or oil painter, an actor, or whatever. You see these common themes. But for the purpose of this video, I don't want to get into just the character and the trait makeup of an artist on that level. I would really want to focus on art and the concept of art as being mentally ill, or at least focusing on the mental illness that's universal in artists. Let's put it that way, because I don't want to right off the bat have people hating on what I'm trying to say here, thinking that I'm putting down artists. I am an artist. Believe me, I love artists. I think they're some of the most fascinating, altruistic, and special people on the planet, really. That said, I made a list of sort of neurotic traits that I observed repeatedly in the various sort of mediums or professions of art, from your comedians to your painters to your actors. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about first. And part of the inspiration for this was, over the time I've heard a lot of negative talk between artists. Comedians would clown on actors. Like I remember hearing Joe Rogan talk about, repeatedly, he would clown on actors about, all they do is they're professional liars. We give them millions of dollars for lying. And then I would hear musicians, cut on comedians. Poets would cut on novelists. And novelists would cut on, your painters and call us idealistic and flighty and impractical. Sound familiar? And I mean, for the most part, the world of artists, there really is a brotherhood that I've observed. So for the most part, this isn't a major theme like in sports where every team has to sort of be always in competition with one another or something. It's really not like that. For the most part, I think there is a brotherhood, but there's some misunderstanding and maybe even some defense mechanism there, some passive aggressiveness where we sort of admire a medium that maybe we didn't pursue, that we wish we could have. I think you see this a lot with actors that want to be musicians, and a lot of musicians that want to be actors. I've definitely noticed that. People like Johnny Depp that, actually he was a musician from what I understand before he was an actor. But for whatever reason, the acting took off more than the music. You could tell he's always had this passion to go back and want to still keep that alive, which is great. But you see that a lot. Or Jim Carrey he's another actor. He's a painter, so he engages in painting quite often. And you see a lot of this, like someone who's very successful in one medium sort of wanting to go into the other. Now, whether they criticize that other medium or not, of course, not everyone's doing that, but there is some of that. A fair amount, enough to comment on anyway. I guess the point that I bring this up for is because I wanted to make the connection that I wanted to reduce that a little bit. I wanted to say, listen, first of all, art is art, and you should respect your brothers. Actors are not liars. They're not professional liars. There's so much more going on to that. It's really a shame if you can't see that. Just as there's so much more to comedians than just going up there and telling a fart joke or whatever it is, but that's how we reduce things sometimes. We don't get it. That's not our world. We have our own as Timothy Leary would call, reality tunnels. And that's where we operate from. And it is a little frustrating. I'm just on a tangent here. Going back to Jim Carrey, I remember he was on Howard Stern and he said something to the effect of, painting, because Howard asked him, did you ever have, schooling? Did you practice a lot of technique? And he goes, oh, no, art is just doing it, or something to that effect, which is a common thing I have heard. He didn't invent that concept. That's a very common thing you hear from people. Art is just creation. It's just doing it. Okay, we'll expand on that. Well, it's just like you take the medium, you take your paintbrush, your toothbrush, you take your paintbrush, and you dip it in the paint, and you got a canvas of some sort, and you just go. It's emotional release, and you just go. And hey, that's poetic, and expressionism, that's true. That is a particular style of painting that's fine. But that's a very small style. It's sort of like knock-knock jokes in the world of comedy, or something to that effect. And I felt like what Jim was doing was a little bit condescending. Well, I'm a big fan of Jim Carrey, but I don't think he realized it was, at least, and maybe it's just me, but I found it a little condescending that you think that's all art is. And that's really what he was saying, that art is just that. Not I do this part of art, but that art is just this. It's just creating. Well, you may be better at creating a realistic portrait, but that doesn't mean anything. He sort of put it all on one level. But if that's true, then, so if I come into the comedy world, if I were to go up to an improv before Jim Carrey's set and just get up there and just try to be funny, because that's all comedy is, right? It's just being funny. So I'll just get up there and be funny. It's just whatever's funny, just be funny. But of course it's not, and he would find that condescending. Like, how dare you think you could just walk up on the stage and do what I do, as if there's no science to it, as if art didn't require this deeper cathartic or this deeper process to it. Like there wasn't something more to it than just getting up here and winging it, So I found that a little frustrating. I forgot where I was going with that, but I wanted to say it anyway. Now going back to the concept of artists being a sort of, to be an artist is to be mentally ill. Again, I'm not saying that's the case. We're just playing with an idea here. We're just loosely looking at some of these things. But let's start looking at the common themes that we find within certain mediums of art. So let's start with comedians. These are just my observations. You may have more or differ, disagree, but in comedians I observed that a lot of comedians use comedy to deflect feeling. Now it's not a neurosis necessarily, but it's psychology, right? And it's a defense mechanism. Let's just call it that, a defense mechanism. And we all have them. There's not a single person alive that doesn't, to some degree, ever use a defense mechanism. It's a natural part of our personality to defend itself against, pain, essentially, mental, emotional. And comedians, I see do this a lot. They make a joke out of anything that's too emotional or too painful for them to deal with. They keep everyone else at the world sort of arm's length away. And a really good comedian or someone who's really good at that craft have a knack for it. And they're difficult people to be in a relationship with, family or otherwise, because they have a way of doing that, of keeping you at arm's reach without you even noticing they've done it. They're so good at it. They pull you into their entertainment and they just sort of push you out there, and you never get to get beneath the surface with them. And for them, that's great, because if a topic's too painful or whatever, they anytime they need to escape, they're gone. And anytime they need to keep you over here, that's where you are. And anytime they need to deflect, they have that ability to do that. And I think more than any other artistic medium, a comedian has that art in their arsenal. Another thing that I realize with comedians that I've observed is that they think their feelings. Now, this is a common concept in psychology, people who think their feelings. So again, very, very universal, very common. So what does that mean, to think your feelings? Well, we don't always feel our feelings. We don't say, how does, you divorced your wife or your husband. How does that make you feel? And some of us will say, it hurts. Oh, they'll talk about the pain and how it felt. But some of us will start talking about, we'll intellectualize it. We'll say, Well, I think I'm in a better place now, and she didn't listen to me, or he didn't listen to me enough anyway in the future, and we start going on, but that's not answering the question. We're sort of, in our own way, we're again pushing those emotions at arm length, and we're getting around them. We're thinking our feelings instead of feeling them, because feeling feelings is sort of this chaotic, irrational, and very vulnerable space, whereas thinking is compartmentalizing them and putting them in a box and putting them on a shelf, and then pushing that shelf just far away from us, and it's all on our terms. And I notice that comedians do that. They think their feelings a lot. They're intellectual, which really makes sense because, look at what they're doing on stage. Their whole craft is if a comedian went up there and was just emoting on the stage, I think a really great comedian has those moments, but if that's all they were doing, I don't even know. I think thinking their feelings is really the staple of good comedy, right? At least one of the staples, if there's multiple staples. So another, I don't know, neurotic trait, maybe we could call it, of comedians, is insecurity. Now, I'm not just speculating all this from the outside. I'm someone who really engaged in a lot of comedy. I used to do comedy videos, and I tried to write comedy. I wrote comedy skits and a lot of comedy material. I'm not claiming to be a comedian at all, but I like to think that I'm someone with a sort of sophisticated sense of humor, and someone who gets humor, and it can be funny, despite how dry these videos are. But I'm also someone who was fortunate enough to grow up with a lot of really funny people, and know comedians, know people who made professional comedians that made a life career out of doing comedy and had some fair success at it. And so I feel like I've had a good insight into these people and into the process a little bit. And one thing I've noticed is a lot of them, and they're open about this, and you can get this in interviews and everything, is the level of insecurity. If you watch a lot of comedians, not when they're trying to be funny, but you watch an interview with one of them, or watch them in a group, they talk about it. I'm insecure. I don't like criticism. I don't like self-evaluation. I don't have a good self-image. I look at myself, in a negative way. And in some way, I think a lot of great comedy is born out of that. That's again something we can get into later, is this crazy, chaotic, what would you call it, dimension that all good art comes from, right? That you just cannot teach. And that's one of them. That one of the domains is sort of being chaotic and insecure from looking at our faults and being able to examine them and play with them and and thrive to have a cathartic moment through them, perhaps. But I notice a lot of comedians, they are insecure. And again, a lot of their jokes are sort of in reference to their insecurities. So what's another one? Depressive, and they struggle with anxiety. I've seen that more than anything, and especially the depression part. Comedians are often really depressed people. In fact, again, they use the comedy to sort of hide it. Some of the most saddest people I've ever met were the funniest people, and they sort of made it their mission to make other people laugh, because they wanted to, I don't know, it was almost like they wanted to remove the sadness that they felt, and they wanted to diminish it in others. And it was so important for them. And when they could do it, you could see that they had a really powerful, meaningful experience. It wasn't just all shits and giggles out there and just having fun. No, there was something deeper about it. And I think a lot of the older, really great comedians got really in touch with that and tried to articulate that. And surprisingly, a lot of comedians dealt with anxiety. You see them on the stage and you think they're 10 foot tall and bulletproof. They're up there and they are killing, and they are not taking any shit, and they seem so confident. But you'd be surprised at how many of them have to have a few drinks before they go up, or drink while they're up there, or literally having a panic attack 10 seconds before their name's called and they walk out on stage. But like all great performers, once they get out there and they start doing their thing, it's like a switch is flipped, and at least for that time, it's a different experience. But off stage and everything, you'd be surprised. You come up to a comedian, if they're not performing, if you just see them in Walmart or a grocery store, and you come up to someone and they're not performing, you might be surprised by how shy and sort of withdrawn that they are. A lot of them will feel the need to sort of turn on suddenly and be that funny persona, especially ones that have a more career based on that persona. But a lot of them will sort of shriek back. So another trait is antisocial behavior. And by antisocial, I mean they're introverted. They get energized from time by themselves, opposed to extroversion and wanting to be around people all the time. Even though they're on a stage and they're out there performing, they are really not, a lot of them anyway, are not really extroverted. They're not going to the party and they're being the life of the party. No, they're the guy in the corner or the girl in the corner sipping a drink and watching the room, And another thing is, in regards to antisocial, is avoidance. They have that, which we've touched on this a lot so far, they have that sort of avoidance personality. They want to avoid confrontation. They want to avoid intense feelings. They don't want a lot of spotlight. There's a lot of avoidance altogether. They might avoid family and friends and problems and things like that. And also, in regards to the antisocial, they're often rebellious, which is a trait I really admire in them, which is a trait I find universal in a lot of artists in general that I really admire personally, is the that rebellious quality. Comedians are rebellious. They love thumbing their finger at authority, and we need that. I mean, I think the greatest comedians on earth have always challenged popular opinion. They've always forced, and great art in general, again, going back to great art has forced us to look at the world in a different light. And if nothing else, if there's a second place to having great art, just the sake of something to see, hear, do, feel, that's what it is, That's the second place of the purpose of art, is to give us something that makes us see the world different and see ourselves different. Because that's how we grow. I mean, that's basic psychology. It's basic human psychology. We don't grow just by doing the same thing over and over and having the same tunnel vision of experiences. We need that. We need someone to come around that shakes us up. We need movers and shakers, So another quality of comedians that I've observed is pessimistic. I've observed that in a lot of them, actually. You seldom meet a comedian that's just happy-go-lucky, looking at the future and this sort of, everything's going to work out great. There's a darkness there, and part of that might be from depression, because depression paints a sort of dark image of things. But I think a lot of that pessimism comes from perception of reality. Comedians are some of my favorite people because they see through the shit. They're philosophers up there. They really are. And they see through it, and they get it. They see the world for, I'm talking about the really good ones anyway, the ones with something really to say and not just looking to say something. These guys get it. And when you get it, when you really see through it, there is a sort of pessimism that comes with it. Don't get me wrong, there's a sense of, hey, everything's going to be okay. But there's also, hey, things aren't okay, though. Things really aren't as peachy and as great as our defense mechanisms would sort of want to put our blinders onto. And I think comedians see that. And I think sometimes that really sort of becomes their burden, is the fact that they can see through all this stuff that no one else seems to be around them seems to even notice. So another area I want to talk about is elitist attitudes. I've noticed with a lot of comedians, they tend to develop this sort of narcissistic tendency to elitism. They think their shit don't stink, simply put. And a lot of them will talk about it. Hey, they'll say, have flaws and this and that. But underneath it, it's this little tinge of, I'm a little bit better than you. And I think some of that, I'm not talking about all comedians, and not any of these things that I mentioned is going to fit all comedians anyway. So, to take it with a grain of salt here, we're just examining something and fun, right? But there is I would say, observable pattern that I've observed with comedians having this sort of elite attitude, this snobby little, I'm better than you. And I think part of that is born in the pessimistic perception, this sort of, I see through the crap, you don't. And that right there puts me slightly above you. Does that make sense? Like when you see it, even if someone you're talking to is more successful, better looking, better career, money, more educated, if they sort of just don't get it, they just don't see the world clearly, you kind of have to acknowledge you have a little bit, and maybe that's the most important criteria, is perception of reality. If there was a hierarchy of what makes a person a better person, dare I say, I think perception of reality is pretty damn high on that list. I'd put it over any Gallardo Mansion, TV special, whatever your thing is, And another area is self-destructiveness. I've noticed in a lot of comedians, that's why there's been a lot of suicides and death comedic world, is there's a very self-destructive quality. And this self-destructiveness, there's so much to be said about this alone in regards to art and creation. You really see this self-destructiveness cross over in a lot of artistic mediums, if not all of them. But comedians, I think they tend to use substances. A lot of them drink. A lot of them, it starts from drinking, having a few drinks to get on stage and get some courage so they can do their act. And when you're doing 2-3 gigs a night, or even a gig a week, over 52 weeks a year, you do the math, it's a lot of drinking, and it ain't going to be long before you start really developing some patterns there. Whether it's cocaine, or just drinking, or you're smoking weed, or heroin, whatever it is for you, you start getting into these really addictive zones. And again, this is very universal for a lot of artists. I think self-destructiveness and addiction alone are very universal for artists. But you also see in destructiveness not just addictions, but self-sabotaging. You see artists that, like comedians in particular here, that sabotage themselves, meaning before they can get what they're after, they seem to sort of almost unconsciously, but purposely, ruin it, whether it's a relationship or a chance at a good gig or their own show or whatever it is. They're afraid of a certain level of success in their professional life, or a certain level of success in their personal lives. And there's a lot to be said about that. And I know this is going on long, and I don't want to get into this, but I think that's room for a topic to come back to, is why do we self-sabotage, especially as an artist of some kind of artist? Why do we do that? Why do we push people away? Why do we ruin a career before we really get that success? What are we afraid of achieving? In my opinion, I think we're afraid of seeing through the illusion of it, and we're afraid of the burden of what those things may bring. If you never really, really love someone, then you don't have to really, really hurt when they leave you, right? So another area, probably the final area of comedians in regards to mental illness that I've noticed, is a search for catharsis. I put this domain on under every artist medium, painters, whatever, actors, novelists. We're all looking for a catharsis. And a lot of us, we don't even know that that's what we were after, until we get there anyway. And some of us, I think a lot of us, make it a goal, like that is the directive, is catharsis. So what do I mean by catharsis? I mean having a moment through your own art that sort of systematically transfigures part of who you are, dynamically changes who you are by allowing you to have these experiences that otherwise couldn't exist. And I don't want to go on, because this is going on long, and I don't want to go in too far into catharsis, but it is an important element of art. And I think if you're an artist and you're listening to this and you're trying to get something personal out of this, go back and do some research on what catharsis means. What is a catharsis? And how do you have a catharsis experience, a cathartic experience through your art if you're a comedian or an actor? Well, take an actor, for example. If you were someone going through a painful divorce, and then you get a role that comes across your desk to be, to have a role of a guy or a girl going through a divorce, that can easily become cathartic. And when you enter into it, you sort of knowingly, or maybe unknowingly, bring yourself involved into it. Very, very high level stuff, where you really put yourself out there and you start using these feelings that you have in your own life regarding your own divorce, and you allow that to bleed through onto camera. And I believe when that happens, whether you're doing acting, comedy, painting, music, especially music, that's when the most powerful art happens, is when you have those. But that's a scary thing. right? Because you could lose yourself in that. I mean, you could get in the middle of that and fall into a deep depression. But the catharsis, to me, means reaching through that process and having a light at the end of the tunnel. And in that regard, like, use an example of an actor, when they get to the end of that tunnel and they've done this film and they've gone through all the motions of the divorce and everything, and then the reconciliation or the life after divorce at the end, that's cathartic for the actor. You know, they walk away from that and they feel different because they went through it. You know, and that's what catharsis is. It's a vicarious sort of, dare I say, vicarious experience. You know, it doesn't force you to go out and have whatever you're after. You don't have to go do it. You know, playing a drug addict as someone who's recovering it and playing the roles of what your life could have been and how your life could have fallen apart, that could be cathartic in its own right. Then you come back and you have this epiphany, this aha moment, like, wow, that's where my life could have went, you know, and it just really hits you at your core and you're a better person after. So that's how I see art. All art and all artists are after that cathartic experience, and it's very powerful. So that's how I see comedians in regards to a list of mental illness, and I'll put these on the screen so you can see them. Now, I want to move to artists. I thought this was fascinating because it made me look at this in a really different light. You know, the different levels of art, different types of artists, and are sort of our own neurotic tendencies, you know. So let's talk about artists. And when I say artists, this one I'm not using as an umbrella. I'm actually meaning artists in the sense of painters, people who work with pencil, drawers, you know, people who paint art, you know, pictures, frame on the wall, artists, galleries, Michelangelo, Dali, Escher, artists. So what are some neurotic qualities that artists have? Okay, I think the primary one that I've heard throughout my entire life, and I'm primarily an artist, is that we live in our own world, or we're fantasy prone, which it sounds really poetic, right? Like, you live in your own world. But and then, you know, it can go another way. Is, what do you live in your own world? You know, wake up to reality. And that kind of goes back to that smugness that I said comedians sometimes have, is because they have that sense of, I live in reality. I don't live in a fairy tale world. I live on earth as it is. And artists can really, I think sometimes can be offensive to comedians because we live in a fantasy world. A lot of us. I mean, I've met artists, some artists that they won't leave Neverland. You know, they're out there. They have created this escaped other side of world for them, and it's not all escape. Some of it, and we'll get to this at the end, is merely really a catharsis. It's a cathartic perception that they engage in, and they process their unconscious through this fantasy or this imaginary world. Okay, yeah, that can be a really, really big problem. But on the other hand, it can make some really fantastic art. And I don't just mean art and paintings. I mean the sets of your films, the design of your house. I mean, virtually anything where an altruistic design aesthetic design comes into play. You know, art is more than just paint on a canvas on your wall. So they live in their own world, for sure, good or bad. Another thing is artists struggle with mental, emotional pain. You know, the self-loathing, self-tortured artist. That's so cliche. The artist that's just always in pain. Well, why is that? I think that says a lot about why they live in their own world, because they're in so much pain. A lot of artists have that. And this is, again, a lot of these things that I'm bringing up that I'm trying to sort of make as domains or characteristics of a particular type of artist. They're really universal to all artists. And you can, I'm sure if I'm saying these things and you're an actor or a comedian, you're going, hey, I identify with that. And sure, why not? But in particular, I think artists, you know, painters and everything, they have especially a struggle with mental and emotional pain. And it does make them want to escape this world. And I think they are prone, maybe just by natural design, to create an alternate universe for themselves. So where does this mental and emotional pain come from? I don't know. I think it's different for all of us. One, I mean, of course it could be trauma, it can be experiences, but I definitely think with artists, it's very existential. I think a lot of artists really see the beauty and see the world from a different type of lens. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to look at the world in pictures. And not just as the world is, but through a different type. You know, even like Monet, when you look at a Monet and you're looking at how he painted maybe the water or a sunset. He's trying to convey an emotional thing about that. And it's very different. I mean, it's so different than what an actor or a comedian or a novelist even does for you, really. I mean, there's a lot of similarities, but in particular, it's a very perceptual, visual, undeniably visually based art form, right? And they're trying to help you see it from a different way, visually, not perceptually, comedians would do. So they have this desire to reframe and articulate life. You know, when an artist sees something, they want to sort of reframe it. Even when they're painting a portrait of someone, usually a really fantastic artist is able to dig deep and see some beautiful quality of someone, and they're able to capture that. And what they're trying to do is emphasize these qualities. Maybe it's a beautiful woman, and something about her. There's something about her, whether the way she wears her clothing, the way she wears her jewelry, the light in her eyes, the texture of her lips, the flow of her hair. There's something about her, our collectivity of all those things, that the artist is trying to sort of get to radiate within their painting or drawing, within their work. They're really trying to reframe life. And reframing is a concept in psychology that comes up a lot. Reframing sort of means taking something that was and sort of redoing it or representing it in a way that feels a little more concise or emphasizes a certain direction or angle of that. And that's really the base of what artists are trying to do, right? So another thing they do is they struggle with anxiety and depression. Just no difference to comedians, right? Artists are some of the most, especially anxiety. I mean, I know a lot of depressed artists, and I know more artists, painters and graphite artists than I do any other art. I mean, hundreds, some of the world's best. I'm fortunate enough to say that I know the best artists alive right now. And I'll tell you, the majority of us, and I want to put us as I'm one of the best, but the majority of them, they struggle with anxiety and depression, but especially anxiety. I think I don't know why, and maybe there should be some psychological studies done on this, on why anxiety in particular for artists versus depression for comedians, But artists, they really struggle with anxiety and have a lot of doubt and worry and fear. And maybe that comes from that place where art was born in them from some mental, emotional pain, some trauma or something. I don't know. And again, not all artists, of course, are dealing. There's a lot of artists that are perfectly happy and they just love to create, and that's what they do, and they didn't have any of those experiences, and they can't even relate to anything I'm saying right now, and that's fine. That does not mean you're not a real artist or anything. I'm not saying that. I'm just talking, again, within the context of looking at this as art and neurosis and neurotic tendencies and these things. So another area that I want to talk about with artists is the highly disassociative sort of breaks from reality itself that a lot of artists go through. I think, again, just in my experience, in my observation with a lot of artists, that we're prone to that. And it sort of ties in with the live in their own world, their own fairy tale world, so to speak. But there's this sort of goes past that. This goes to a real disassociative, sort of more severe psychological neurotic place where you actually disassociate from yourself, breaks from reality, where you can't tell who you are or what reality is. And I think a lot of this happens during the actual creation of art, which in a way can be very blissful, but it can also be very fearful, especially when you have these away from the sort of engaged Zen-like state of creating art, and you're just in your world, and you have these fleeting moments, thankfully fleeting, though with some artists it can last for quite a long time, and you just don't know who you are. And you don't know what the universe is all about. You don't have it all planned out. And it's sort of the yang to the yin of that comedians have, that I have reality. This is reality. This is how it is, guys. And an artist have these moments that they say, is it? Or is it your illusion? Is it your perception? How do you know? It's a very psychedelic space that sort of turns everything inside out and upside down on itself. How do you know? How do you know this is what it is? How do you know that this isn't a dream within a dream? How do you know that? And who am I? You think you know who you are? Why? Because you're the result of all your experiences and how you were raised. You don't think you exist somewhere deeper, or maybe nowhere beneath or beyond all of that? And those are, on some level, those are fascinating thoughts, but the deeper you go with those, there's a line between enlightenment, I think, or having a sense of an enlightened perception and a sense of insanity. It's a thin line between genius and insane. So another area worth mentioning with the artists is they experience intense emotions. They feel their thoughts. Again, this is very opposing to comedians who think their feelings. Artists feel their thoughts. So what does that mean? Feel their thoughts. I mean, they're too feely, right? And your experience with a lot of artists, you say, what do you think of, you ask an artist, what do you think of Donald Trump? And whatever answer they're going to give you is going to come right out of the shadow, right out of a place of feeling, of maybe fear, or if they really like Trump, it's some kind of positive feeling coming from it. Oh, I think, they won't even say I think, they're going to say I feel like if he's, elected, brimstone and fire, and they're going to, they start going into this place of like this dark, moody feeling. And it's very different than the analytical process of a comedian. They go to it's visual, but it's still, it's visual as in context to they're visualizing their emotions. But there is the stimulus, the result of the stimulus is emotion, nonetheless. It's not analytic. So artists can be over emotional. Let's just put it that way. They feel too intensely. But that's not necessarily a bad thing at all, really. A lot of these things I'm mentioning with all artists and actors and comedians, these are not necessarily always bad things. Are they neurotic? Yes. Are they abnormal? Sure. They're sort of like operating on a spectrum, a sliding spectrum. Having the ability to feel very deeply can be great, and it can make great art, and it can make for very intense, powerful connections and relationships. On the other hand, it can be a hell of a lot of work and a hell of a lot of burden and a hell of a lot of headache for someone to deal with that. And it can cause, again, highly disassociative breaks from reality when someone's so stuck in their emotional state and their perceptual worlds and they're in their visual world that they're actually snapping from the reality they live in. They become very idealistic or whatever. So lastly, artists often struggle with self-esteem. This is something I've definitely noticed. Artists lack self-esteem. A lot of us, we are our own worst critic. It is so true. And that's, again, a universal theme, but especially with painters and drawers and pencil artists and such. I mean, we're the last person to see a good thing in our work. We're very, and in ourselves. Like, I think we're just, there's a Zen quality in creating art that I think we get led down without even knowing it. Because creating art and painting and everything is it's not an analytical process. It's a very in the now, beyond mind, connected to a feeling, if anything, conscious state, like a samurai sword cutting through thoughts. That's what the artistic process is for an artist. But with that comes this double-edged sword, so to speak, this sort of double experience where everything becomes beautiful, but everything becomes very fearful at the same time, unstable. And I think we look at ourselves, and as our ego begins to sort of disappear through the creative process, we have these moments of feeling very strongly who we are and feeling very powerful within ourselves, to sort of like that razor's edge falling down the other side and having these intense, fearful moments of not knowing who we are and what we're worth and what our connection is. And we feel lost and confused and chaotic, and it's scary. And I think that's really the heart of the struggle of self-esteem with artists. Again, artists search for catharsis, for sure. And whatever their painting is, I mean, if they're painting someone they love that's passed away, there's a catharsis in that. They want to see it that way. They want to see something in them. They're going to accent something in that person so they can have this emotional relief. And it's very personal when you're, especially with portrait work. I've noticed, I did a portrait of Robin Williams. In every portrait I do, I find features of the person, and it's like a journey. It's like, wow, I almost wish everyone could have this experience where it's very personal, whether it's a dimple, a certain scar, a cowlick in his hair, whatever it is, there's these things that you stumble upon and you just find quite beautiful. and quite unique, and it's very personal with the individual. And I think that in itself can be very special when you're an artist and you're trying to pay tribute to someone, especially someone that's passed away. But in all levels of creation of art, you're doing that. Again, you're having that cathartic experience, you're reframing it, and you're trying to recapture it in a way that sort of lights your soul on fire. Whether it's you're painting a sky, or drawing a monster, or trying to give testimony to some unconscious, subconscious, conflicting feeling within you, and it comes out like one of these Dali paintings, or you're trying to give testimony to some existential crisis dealing with death and aging. It's a search for catharsis for sure. Next, we're going to take a look at musicians. Now, I like to think that I was an artist first because I think my artistic attributes, maybe, I guess we could say, my propensity towards art was evident even as a child. I was doing things, finger paintings and coloring, and just things that were a little bit higher level skillfully than my peers. I could tell that even as a young age, that I sort of had a propensity towards creation in that fashion. But as I became a teenager, early young teenager, I really fell in love with music, and I discovered that, in a lot of ways, what I really wanted to do was music. Of course, trying to become a musician and form a band and all these type of things is one of the most astronomically difficult things on the planet. But still, I played music just like I create art for myself, and not to be successful and not to be a celebrity or something, but just because I loved the process of it. So that said, a lot of the observations that I had growing up with different musicians, like going to concerts, I met so many musicians after shows growing up, especially in the 90s. I met so many musicians at places like House of Blues, and had such really rare, great conversations with some of these guys that I don't think a lot of fans or people, especially teenagers, get to have. One thing I've noticed with musicians, sort of studying them again, is that they're often antisocial. They sort of have that introverted, avoidance, rebellious, sometimes even bummy. I hate to say that because I love musicians, but we all know that musician who sort of doesn't bathe and he just lets his hair grow and all he cares about is playing music, and he's almost addicted to his music, you know what I mean? And another area is they feel thoughts versus thinking thoughts. They feel it. I think musicians and artists, like painters and graphite artists, they're very similar in that regard, that they feel thoughts. I mean, the greatest musicians are the ones that they are able to just disappear in their music, which is very different than comedy. Not entirely, but a bit different. I think comedy's got to be more analytic, and you got to have that punchline. You got to have a certain order of things. You can't just get up there and lose yourself. Although some of the best comedy ever has had those moments, but whereas even with music, you could just go off, in a solo or whatever it is, and have this totally improv, long moment of just pure bliss. But they feel their thoughts more than thinking of them. I think musicians are definitely more feelers than thinkers. Another thing is they live in their own world. They struggle with addictions. That's maybe more than any other artist. Musicians struggle with addictions. I mean, look at how many people we've lost to addiction alone. It's really concerning. Sometimes musicians can be aloof, and they often struggle with anxiety and depression. Now, I'm kind of breezing through some of these because we've already gone in depth on things like addiction and feeling thoughts, so I'm not going to bore you with reiterating all that. But they're worth mentioning. Musicians often deal with anxiety and depression, for sure. I think a lot of musicians have trauma. I think these are a lot of universal traits that we're observing here. And I do think, like any other artist, musicians are out searching for that cathartic experience, for sure. I think their cathartic experience happens in two levels. It's the connection with the crowd and that energy, and it's also with the music. And no, at a third level, with their band members. There's something that's very powerful, which, you know what? I really miss that in being a comedian or being an artist or an actor. Maybe not so much an actor, but especially being a comedian or an artist, especially an artist. We don't have that. We don't have that brotherhood, that your band members are like your brothers. And you're united on this like fifth dimension of music, this musical plane that you guys exist on, that just transcends all your politics and bullshit. And it's beautiful. It really is something special. And you guys have this magical alchemical thing between you guys as you play. Yeah, it's definitely something in life that I think is meaningful as sex. To die without having had that taste is kind of sad a little bit. So next we look at writers, and this will be the last one. If you're still awake, thank you for being still awake. So writers. My experience with writing is I've written 3 novels. I'm working on my 4th. I've written tons of short stories. I've written literally hundreds and hundreds of poems. I started writing poetry when I was a young teenager. Kind of a Renaissance artist, I think. And then and that's why I wanted to do this video and talk about these things, because I related so deeply to a lot of these different mediums, because throughout my life I just engaged in them and I saw the beauty in them. It's sort of like when you're a mixed martial artist, and you do taekwondo or one of those styles, and you see the beauty, and then you meet someone who does wrestling or something, and they see that beauty, and then when you have that taste of both, it's like, oh, I get it now. It's not this or that, it's both. But anyway, that said, my experience with writers, and some of my best friends are writers, is they struggle with depression, anxiety, especially depression. And historically, looking at writers, I think that's pretty evident. Hemingway and just a lot of writers that have committed suicide and battle with addiction. A lot of writers can't write without drinking. I never was that type of writer. Like I prefer not to write drinking. Sometimes smoking a little something might help, but I didn't really like to write when I was drinking, and I'm glad that never was that way, because I think if I would have got sweet on me, I could have got carried away very quickly with that. But still, a lot. I know plenty of writers that they can only write when they're drinking. And the other thing is antisocial tendencies. I mean, writers, again, live in their own worlds. They create their own worlds. They reframe their own worlds with characters. A writer is someone that if they can't deal with something in their own life, they can write a story about it and create this play within their minds where they get to become the characters and alternate the whole universe. It's sort of like playing God. And they get to take these characters and have them go through a cathartic experience, and put them through a series of trials and lessons and all these type of things. It's a very powerful, but sort of primitive in the sense that it takes us all the way back to our childhood when we used to play with, action figures and G.I. Joes or your Barbie dolls. And you would, I don't know how many of you, if you've done that, had those moments where it wasn't just that you were just bouncing around playing with these things, but you were actually having these storylines, and you were reacting things. You had these sort of mythology going on in your play. And myth is very, very connected to play. So they had the antisocial tendencies, struggle addiction, suicidal prone, but they're also pessimistic. Writers, I haven't had too many writers that are very optimistic for the future. Most of the ones I know, sort of like comedians, they have that edge of just, the world is kind of shit. And, the world's a shit sandwich, and the more bread you got, the less shit you got to eat kind of attitude. Not to say that they're, prone to money or anything, but they just see the way the world operates. As I mentioned, they lived in their own world. They have intense desire to reframe actual events. We've talked about that. They often struggle with interpersonal relationships. And, that's an area where so much can be said about any artist. Why do we struggle with the people in our lives? What does that mean? Where's that coming from? What is it that makes us struggle with that so much? Is it a reflection of the work that we do? Well, what is it? Nonetheless, I've seen a lot of writers that were very lonely, and in the end they ended up alone, and they lived in their worlds, and they're very reclusive and divorced and separate from their families and things. Another thing that I noticed with writers is they think their feelings. Kind of going back to the comedians, they think their feelings, and they use writing to feel their feelings. So they use writing as a cathartic tool to get to get to feeling their feelings, to translate those thoughts into feelings. Now, writing is a very analytical process, much more than I think if anyone could even comprehend if you haven't tried to sit down and write a novel and actually studied the craft. Nothing is really happening by accident, so to speak. A writer, anything that happens in a storyline is set there to move the story forward. It's to create character. There's a reason. There really is a methodical reason for almost every single word and every single sentence within a good novel. But that said, the deeper experience that the writer's having is that they're sort of transmuting their thoughts into feelings, and they're using their writing to help them feel feelings. I had such deep levels of getting in touch with my own feelings and having like just the sensation of a feeling of, when you create, you have a feeling, whether you're creating something sad or beautiful, it touches you. It touches the artist very deeply. And that's what we're after. We want to have that experience. We won't just give it to someone else. We want to have that experience. And writing has been so powerful. Like I've literally teared up and cried in parts that I was writing. I've had such great feelings, like just like you would having but I think way more so than when you would have watching a great movie. We've all watched films that just brought tears to our eyes, or got that feeling in your chest of like, oh man, I could conquer this thing in my life, this inspiration. Like we've all had these things, or this fear in the pit of you, in the pit of your stomach, or whatever it is. We've all had that. In writers, we feel that on such an intense level. And again, finally, writers are looking for catharsis. Just like any other artist, we're looking for that aha moment, that enlightening moment, that processing. In psychology and psychodynamic psychology, they call it processing, meaning you just sit with these intense feelings and thoughts and you process them, and that's what a good story does for you. It leads you to a higher end and an answer, but it really helps you. The magic is a personal journey, and it really happens with processing, I think. So these are some traits that I've observed in different artists and different art mediums, and maybe you found them fascinating. Maybe you have some input. If you do, I'd really like to hear it. Maybe leave a comment or write me or something. But yeah, it's something I had been thinking about quite a bit over the last couple of years, and I finally just said, what the hell, I'm going to do a little video, like a podcast, and just share some of these thoughts. So if you're like me, I think you're fascinated by the artistic mind. I've said this before, that I'm more fascinated in what other artists have to say than I am politicians. I'm just fascinated by that mindset. So if you are similar, maybe you've got something out of this. Thanks for listening.